We are living interesting times. My question is, in 10, 20 years, will we still call the COVID times, or will we call it the Great Reflection times? At the end of last year, Gartner conducted a survey about what has changed in the mindset of people because of the pandemic. 65% value more other things than work. There is 56% who wants to contribute more to society. 52% question the purpose of their work. And the thing is that this search for purpose at work is in the back of the minds of the majority of people. And finding alternatives is becoming critical, essential for us. Now, the search for meaning through spirituality is something that is sometimes misunderstood. In particular, when we think about Buddhism, we think about religion, or we think about meditation and yoga mats. But it's more than that. In reality, what do I know? For that, I have invited someone, Ryan Estes, that has made the conscious choice to live these principles in his own life and in his own company. Now, before that, let me introduce a little bit about Ryan. Ryan Estes is the founder of Kitcaster and Wildcast. He's a marketeer and tech founder. He's disrupting the podcast industry. Wow, there is a little bit of story with connection, right? But more than that, his vision on how to lead companies that are purpose-driven is what makes him the appropriate guest for our episode today on building a business based on spiritual principles. Ryan, thank you very much for making the time to be with me. And I wanted to start just with one simple question. So how did it all started with your interest? By the way, I know a lot that in the USA, a lot of people has converted or is following the principles of Buddhism. I have heard that David Bowie was Buddhist, Steve Jobs, even Adam Yauch, one of my favorite from one of my favorite groups, Beastie Boys, back in the days. And I wanted to understand, did it happen for you in the same way? Or was it a trend, or how did you discover Buddhism?
Ivan, thank you so much. I'm so excited to speak with you, particularly about this subject. I really appreciate it. I'm happy to be here. So yeah, I think Buddhism does, at least in the States, have a certain amount of cultural cachet, particularly in the 90s. You mentioned Adam Yauch with the Beastie Boys was pretty instrumental with the Free Tibet movement back then, doing big concerts and things like that. So definitely got your attention of like kind of, hey, what's going on with these guys in these cool orange robes? And that's really where it started with me, is within high school. I think I was attracted most to kind of the aesthetic, particularly like kind of the feudal Japan aesthetic with the rice paper walls and the sandals and the samurais. It's just gorgeous. It was like it had a gravitational pull to me. So I kind of sought out, what is the components of this? Seeing Buddhas with their, stoic yet somewhat smiling faces, calmly sitting in that lotus position, in statues all over the world throughout antiquity. It's like, what's going on here? What is enlightenment? What are these big ideas? So that really started it in high school. I picked up a copy of the Tao Te Ching from some cool used bookstore and, opened it and started reading. It was immediately taken by the first verse, which is, the way that can be spoken is not the true way, which is absolutely hilarious considering it's a book. So it's like if I was to intro this conversation by saying anything I say right now is going to make no sense. So now let's have a conversation for an hour. So kind of the opacity of that, particularly the Tao Te Ching, really caught my interest in all of the kind of polarities and the opposites and the unity of it was really interesting to me. So, I kind of began a meditation practice, which for many years just involved me sitting there being like, or am I doing this right? Which also then started to lead to like practicing yoga. Yoga is kind of ubiquitous now, but 1994, 1995, maybe you had a couple of places, there was a couple of gals that got juice at Whole Foods and they did yoga. So that was also had a certain gravity to it. So that was really my start in kind of the Buddhist teachings, Taoism obviously predating Buddhist, but kind of like that whole Eastern esoteric kind of tradition.
Wow, that was quite early, in fact, because usually this is a time where we think about partying, music, girls, and you were thinking about principles of life. Wow. So you should be the odd one within your group, or was it like a trend in around you?
Oh, I was definitely thinking about music and girls. Don't worry about that. Playing guitar. I mean, come on now. Yeah, no, I don't think it was a trend per se. I mean, I had some friends that were interested, and a lot of that would probably be like those late nights sitting around the keg at the keg party and having philosophical discussions. I absolutely live for that, and have been fortunate enough to somehow make my living through that. Essentially, podcasting is just a big keg party, Ivan. Don't you know?
Yo,
Um,
yes.
so yeah, it not necessarily a trend, but also I've always been kind of drawn to all religions, all kind of wisdom traditions. Through I was kind of raised a Protestant. Um, Started meditating. I was introduced to a Lakota community where I did a lot of ceremonies with Lakotas here in Colorado. And then stint as atheist, and have kind of gone through a lot of different modalities. But I think really the thread is like kind of a seeker. I'm looking for truth and wisdom, and I think early on you kind of get stuck into these silos. Perhaps you're like, hey, which ideas are going to win? And I think as that's kind of evolved over time, I've really learned how to like be interested and enthusiastic about all of them. So when we're having a conversation about Buddhism, I like to make some distinctions about American Buddhism, because certainly the culture is very prevalent in all Buddhist traditions. There's Buddhism all over the world, and they all have different cultural traditions. So in America, the Buddhist tradition is very young. And so we're trying to grapple with what is Americans' contribution to Buddhism, what can we offer the community as a whole, and also how are we going to incorporate some of these principles into our practice?
You're right. Now that I think back, um, I I have heard about Westerners converting to Buddhism. Mainly in the early 20s, there was people like writers like Hermann Hesse. I think he was German or Austrian, one of those. So who converted to Buddhism, and there was other writers who were following. But in the USA, I think it came quite after the 50s that there was an integration into this culture of hippies. Let's call it like that. There was an integration of these spiritual principles in this ideology. Now, I wanted to ask you, for people who aren't aware of Buddhist principles, what does it mean to live and breathe these principles in your day-to-day life?
I can speak about what it means for me.
Yep. Yeah.
Because Buddhism is notorious for their lists. They've got lists of the principles that you should live by, and the principles have lists. And that kind of structure and organization also I really am fond of. Being a systems and process guy, I'm like, wow, look at all these like well-organized bullet points. And Buddhism is a lot of different things for a lot of different people. Statistically, I think Buddhists worldwide, like 95% of them don't have any contemplative meditation practice at all. It's really more of a religious practice, to that point, like you said, somebody converted into Buddhism, which from my perspective is kind of interesting, because there's really no conversion. Buddhism has a way of soaking into a culture or into different religious traditions. There's no odds. It's not like I was once this, now I'm Buddhist. It's like, no, whether Buddhism kind of soaks into the thing that you already are.
That's right.
So and also to your point too about the expansion of Buddhism into America, it's also important to note, as you pointed out, that it really started later 50s and 60s, and a lot of that was from hippies. hippies that, I want to be careful with my words, were having experiences on substances that opened up, chambers of consciousness in their mind, potentialities, let's say, that can be kind of destabilizing. And so a lot of them went to India, and found gurus or teachers. And then they returned to the US with these teachings. And that's kind of the foundation of our core. So when we're talking about girls and rock and roll and all that stuff, boy, that's a major part of the inception of Buddhism in this country. And now we're also seeing kind of like the fallout from that, because as we also know, drugs, sex, and rock and roll has a certain cost and expense. And most certainly those folks back then, particularly in Colorado, had some damage that was done. I think the communities are in the process of healing right now. Remind me the first part of your questions. I went off on a tangent there.
The core of the question was about what do you do in the day-to-day life that can be considered that you're following Buddhist principles?
Yes, absolutely. So Buddhist principles. In my practice, and this is kind of taking the lead from the Dalai Lama, where the Dalai Lama said, if you're reading our scriptures and there's a section where it said that the Buddha walked and flowers bloomed from his footprints, he's like, take that with a grain of salt. That's poetry. We understand with physics and science that actually that can't happen, which is really refreshing. So that's to say that in Buddhism, there's a very small lift when you're talking about things to believe. And in fact, particularly with Zen Buddhism, there's nothing to believe. You don't need a doctrine that can be helpful. You don't need a teacher, it can be helpful, but there's nothing to believe here. Rather, Buddhism is something that you do. So the principles of Buddhism, I see as kind of a technology and basically a tool that I can use to emphasize the things that are important to me. So when I look at my life, I have certain ambitions. I want to be a good husband. I want to be a good father. I want to be a good friend. I want to be good at business and fair in my dealings. I want to have admiration and respect from the people that I work with and my colleagues. And how do I get to that point? That's the destination. I want to cultivate kindness, and I want to cultivate a sense of peace and calm. So these aren't things that you believe in, rather something that you actually do, So there's different techniques as far as contemplative techniques that will evoke different consciousness states and different states of being. So with the end goal being hey, I want to be the best person I can for the people that I love and for the people that have expectations on me. What are the practices that will lead me to that? And I'm happy to talk about those practices if you'd like.
That would be good. Before that, when you were talking, I was thinking that, during the last 10 years, you are certainly aware that there has been a lot of writing about behavioral science, neuroscience, in order to understand how the brain processes certain things, in fact, that you have mentioned. For instance, kindness, the feeling of trust. What does it produce as molecules inside of our brain? Or, well, you didn't mention it, but I know about Buddhism is the principle of enlightenment that can be associated to self-awareness. So these are principles that are in need, in fact, in our current society. And of course, it is very difficult for organizations, like in the workplace, to implement because they don't know how. They think that is still the usual way of training people. It needs to be in a training class. You get a couple of slides, 2 hours or 1 day of slides, and then you can practice. And in fact, the practice of self-awareness, the practice of kindness is something that takes time, and you need to start practicing. In fact, you need to do it in a recurrent manner, a little bit like when you go to the gym to take care of your body. So it's very, very difficult, but it's almost like principles that were created 1,500 years ago, or even more, I don't remember exactly, are coming back because of science, because science is making it relevant for the way we think today. We are thinking about our own psychology. We are thinking about how the brain, how we can find purpose in life, and how the brain reacts when you don't feel either belonging or you feel alone. And well, COVID has accelerated a little bit the movement, because finally people has opened up towards the stress that we are living in our day-to-day life and all the distractions that we're having, that and our brain is paying a toll, and this is reflected with burnout, anxiety, and so on. I wanted to get back to relate it more, like I want to talk to you a little bit like a businessman. What have you observed that businesses are missing to have employees that are happy to go to work?
Yeah, I can actually tie this into kind of what you were talking about. I think, you mentioned like, hey, if you work out your body, you can expect results, so like you can't get big biceps unless you're doing the curls, and they found the same thing with brain science as far as like creating new neural pathways. So what they say is altered states create altered traits. So if the goal is like, I want peace and calm, you take it the same way that you would like, I want big biceps. So you create practice around cultivating peace and calm. And what it does is it actually rewires the brain into new pathways. And what we know, just like getting big biceps, is the more you do that, the more solidified those new pathways get. So the more opportunities you have to actually experience those outcomes that you want. Again, this is a great response to the enthusiasm of Buddhism in the 50s and 60s that, turned to science. And they were able to speak to us in kind of our language. I think this is also really important to America's contribution to Buddhism, because culturally, I can't help the feeling of feeling like an outsider. You're reading scripts from India, you're reading stuff from Tibet, and like the names alone, it's like I don't even try and pronounce them in my head. I'm like, boy, that's so many vowels and consonants. Beautiful, but it's just so outside of my scope. It's not my language. I mean, I went to school and was educated. I'm a scientific materialist at heart. A lot of these principles, energy and chakras and things like that, doesn't land in the way if someone's like, no, I can see clear changes and indications from your endocrine system as based by these experiments A, B, and C. That's my cultural language. So I think you're totally correct that what we're seeing is that these spiritual principles are actually full of academic rigor. And why wouldn't they be? They're 2,500 years old, maybe 5,000 years old. Generations and generations of people have been poring over these. So there's no reason that there isn't the same kind of academic rigor over generations. Rather, it's just not in the same language that we're accustomed to using. So now we're starting to see the bridge of like, oh, when they talk about this is what it means to us. And it kind of comes together. So things in the mind now are things in the brain, because the brain is the gray matter with wrinkles in it. You can poke it and stuff. The mind, who knows what that is? So I think that there is an important distinction. So in corporate culture, let's say traditionally, and let's just speak stereotypically, because if I think corporate culture, I'm thinking of like Gordon Gekko in the 80s, the high-powered capitalist psychopaths.
I watched the movie again like 2 weeks ago.
Nice. It's great. Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. They meant that to be like abhorrent, and everybody took it as like some gospel truth.
Oh, yeah.
But it's the same way, every tradition speaks on the merits of virtue, and they talk about virtue being of its own merit. It's like, hey, here's some guideposts from 1,000 generations have gone before. You might want to consider doing this. In the same way they look at vice and say like, hey, here's some dangerous things about being a human. We're all hardwired in a certain way to have lust, greed, envy, jealousy, hatred, violence. All these things are in us, and we're kind of taught from every wisdom tradition that like, you should be wary of that. You should steer clear of that, and it's for the same reason, altered states create altered traits. So I think the problem is that the reward system, at least in corporate culture, kind of traditionally, is all geared towards selfishness and greed. Unfortunately, there's not a large voice at the table. Yeah. There's not a large voice at the table for compassion and kindness, largely because these people are legally bound to positively influencing their stakeholders
Hmm.
share. So it's like it's not about like goodness, it's not about tenderness and kindness. Rather, you're constantly reinforced for some selfish kind of reasons.
Hmm.
So as that happens, and I'm going to mention this, although it's something I heard in passing on a podcast, that in the same way that they've studied Buddhists' brains, like monks that have 10,000 hours of meditation practice, like you mentioned, and you can see some different traits. Billionaires have a similar characteristic, only on the opposite spectrum. That like when showed images of people like suffering, like nothing lights up in their compassion side of their brain. Like it's kind of like blocked off, so that they've actually developed maybe a superhuman capability to not be empathetic to people that are suffering. So is that a product of corporate culture, or are they just naturally talented in some horrific way? I don't know, but interesting to note at least.
Ryan, so now I want to catch up with what you mentioned a couple of minutes ago. It is about the practice. So you have highlighted the fact that the creation of new pathways in our brain makes it, solidifies it, and creates like, makes it more natural, in fact. So whatever practice that we have, even if it is a breathing exercises or meditation as such, because of our brain, we can do it in a natural way to, even if we do it not like people who are really into the expertise of meditation, but even if we can do it a couple of minutes every day, it becomes a routine, and you are capable of, I don't know, detecting a little bit more your emotions, being able to control, to manage the what goes outside, and also the sense of not caring about things that are at the end not that important. So I'm a good believer of that. You don't have to start with trying with 1 hour of meditation. By the way, I have a lot of problems reaching 1 hour of meditation, but I am quite constant on my path to improve it. Like I do it every single day, but I don't do it that long. That has allowed me, in fact, to improve a lot of anxieties that I have personally. Now, what are the regular practices that for the people who wants to start using the principles of spirituality or Buddhism to start, that they can start easily? People wants to have something tangible, but not difficult. If you say like 1 or 2 hours every single day of meditation to start, is going to be tough for most of us.
Oh man, 2 hours of meditation is hard for everybody. That's a
Oh,
lot. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Meditation, talk about it in 2 ways. I'm happy to talk about it in spiritual terms, but also for your audience that's probably not inclined to like spiritual terminology. Meditation, what does that mean? Enlightenment, what does that mean? What are all these lofty things? Really, if you just call it non-sleep deep rest, then you can understand pretty easily, like, this could be positive for me. From a spiritual angle, you got to be careful of the trap, which is to say, like, I'm doing this for some self-improvement. That's a major hole you can fall into. If you don't take a spiritual component to it at all, you're just like, no, this is non-sleep deep rest. It's so productive and so good for you. And the probably a really good technique for people to start with this is just kind of like body scans, is what they'll call a body scan. So what you can do is you just lay down and get comfortable, that's it. And what I do is I start with the joints in my toes and I just say release. And as I say release, I imagine the joints in my toes just fully relaxing. And then I go up to my ankles and I say release. And I just let all the joints in my ankles fully relax. And then the knees, and then the hips, and then the spine. And then you kind of go up and up and up and up. And just up and down, up and down. What's common is that you'll probably get to, if you're lucky, your knees. And now you're starting to think about your grocery list, and everything will come in, which is okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But then you can just say, like, you know what? right now I'm just doing non-sleep deep rest. I'm really fully relaxing. So what it does is it'll show you pretty quickly, like, wow, I'm holding a little bit of tension in my right calf. And so you can kind of hold your attention on it and relax. And you'll kind of see, your feet relax a little bit, or your knees or something like that. So that's an example of something that's not too heady. A lot of times, people go straight to like Vipassana and mindfulness meditations of observing your thoughts. And that can be really challenging. It's a hard practice for everybody. But rather, if you give your brain a task, we're much better, especially Americans, task oriented. I'm here to relax as best as I possibly can, and do that, for as long as you can. If it's 5 or 10 minutes, great. I like to do 20-minute sessions. That seems to be like kind of a good rhythm for me for whatever practice I'm doing, generally speaking. So that's a really good one. People use mantra and prayer in a similar way. As far as just speaking to like keeping your brain occupied while you're doing some of these postures or deep rest positions.
Mm. So from a science perspective, what we are doing, in fact, is to train our brain to focus in some parts of our body, right? It is, I mean, it's not per se that there is going to be some spiritual thing that is going to come to your toe to relax it. It's your brain controlling, but you are paying attention, focusing on one single thing in order to detect emotions. I mean, yes, it sounds a little bit weird. Emotions from your toe. In fact, every sense that we have comes from our brain. So it is not exactly our toe who feels. It's our brain who tells us there is pressure, and then I need to feel something. So we are, in fact, training our brain. And as you said, we it's not about doing it for long time. It's certain things like the practice that you have mentioned. It can be done starting with 5 minutes. It is something that is quite useful, especially if you do it like early in the morning, going to, I don't know, to work or to start the day, because we have a lot of interaction. Even when we are working from home, we have all the interactions of our family, and God knows how difficult emotionally it is to be with our family, right, Ryan?
No, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, okay, you're the only one.
Yeah, no, to that point, consciously calming down and relaxing is something you can practice and something you get good at. I mean, everybody is stressed. Everybody has anxiety. Everybody goes through periods of depression. We live in an incredibly complex time where things are thrown at us that are like our brain can't handle it, And so what happens is we have involuntary physical reactions. Probably the most notorious one is you'll start to like creep your shoulders up a little bit. Like when you're typing or something, you start to like scrunch up. And it's your body naturally protecting your neck, because your neck is your most vulnerable place. So like if you're in danger, you'll start to scrunch up, And if you don't notice, you might be typing like this all day. But if you're doing kind of a body scan, you're like, wow, look at my shoulders are actually really tense. And I'm not intending to do that. So you can relax it intentionally. You can sit up straight. You can take a deep breath, particularly around the breath. If you're breathing out longer than you're breathing in, you're telling your brain that you're safe. So there's these tips you can have where you're like, God, I'm so stressed out. I just want to get rid of the stress. It's like, well, actually do it. Just stop being stressed out, which is going to be releasing the tension as much as you can from your body. Breathe out longer than you're breathing in. Maybe you breathe out to the count of 7, you breathe into the count of 5, and it tells your brain that you're safe. So the external world and your subconscious mind might be constantly telling you you should be afraid, when really you're just in your kitchen eating breakfast, watching the news. You remind your body that, like, I know the TV is saying some really scary things right now, but you're safe. You're eating breakfast in your home and you can relax. So with the process of practicing that intentionally, let's say if you started doing that 2 or 3 times a week, and then that became 6 times a week, and then it became once a day, and then it becomes 3 times a day, 7 times a day, and then maybe you're at a point where like you're kind of checking in all the time. Where am I stiff? Where am I holding tension? Where am I holding stress? How do I relax that out? It's just good as far as like your general mental well-being.
Hmm.
And really, there's no risk associated with it. It's like just
Exactly.
consciously relaxing is never going to hurt you.
And the crazy thing is that even when you are not in the posture to relax, like touching your toes or even having some breathing exercises, it can come once you practice it in a regular basis, it comes naturally. You know how to relax. Suddenly you are having like a stressful moment, like me when I'm presenting in front of people. I mean, no matters how many years I have been presenting in front of people, I'm still stressed. So that practice comes back naturally. I can focus a little bit more on my breathing, feeling a little bit of my body, and I don't have to look like I'm doing some meditation or yoga. I can do it at any time.
Totally.
So from what we are saying is that from relaxation, it can go to a little bit detecting, a little bit getting to know a little some of your emotions, and it can be even expanded that recognizing, feeling people's emotions without even thinking about it, like naturally recognizing certain body movements, the type of language that you are using or they are using in order to react appropriately. So it's not only about you, it can go into this interaction mode. That's quite powerful, especially in the business world. Coming back to the business world, Ryan. So what we know is that businesses are made to generate revenues for shareholders and products that consumers want or love. So what is the benefit to embed spiritual principles in this business? You can do that without.
The benefits. Well, this is something I wrestle with, because is it good on its own virtue? Are the merits worth it on its own self? Is being trustworthy, being honest, doing the right thing? Is that especially within kind of like our capitalistic framework, is that good for business? I don't know. I think it's good for someone's personally, or even better than that, it doesn't hurt. There was a story recently about the CFO for Bed Bath and Beyond threw himself out of an 18-story window, a couple of days ago, and like it really kind of got me. It's like, that company has been on a downside, and there was questions about some of his like insider trading, maybe in a stock, and all that noise inside of him to make him do that, I think is just kind of emblematic of like, at what cost is this good for business? you and everybody asks themselves that. Not everybody's talented with whatever non-empathetic gene. Most people do have empathy, and most people, if they're doing something that might be negatively affected, it horribly disfigures them from an emotional, spiritual level. So while I'm kind of hesitant to talk about spiritual practice, the benefits of it, because truly, if you're going into it with benefits as being your desired outcomes, you're going to get what you're going to do is you're going to get caught into some cult. There's going to be some guy with a salty ponytail and a thumb ring that's going to have a place for you on his compound. You got you got to be careful for that. But that being said, there are benefits. But as opposed to the benefits, what's important to me as it translates to work in particular is the idea that the benefits aren't important. The negative sides aren't important. What's important is that I show up and I can relax my body and I can be helpful and of use to my colleagues, my stakeholders, everybody like that. So there's a great Zen monk named Dogen who had just wonderful poetry. It's really cool to read, but he's really kind of famous for one scripture, which he said, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. There is no transformational thing that's going to save you. If you're going to like spiritual practice because you're like, I need something to fix me, it nothing works. You're stuck with who you are. You can learn to sit with it. How this translates to me over to business is I find myself that my happiness or lack of happiness is directly tied to my profit margins, and that's troubling because I don't want something external to like have its grips around my spirit, So let's say, hey, we're up 20% this month. Awesome. I'm so excited. Chop wood, carry water. Next day, what's up? We're down 50%. Oh my God. Oh no. Next day, chop wood, carry water. The way I'm carrying myself and conducting myself on a daily basis is going to be influenced by my profit margin, no doubt. But I'm going to wake up the next day and work the same way that I did the day before, because my goal is to like make sure that I'm a calm, stable, helpful person as much as I possibly can be.
I think you have really nailed the point, because so it is not the way I asked the question is a little bit tricky, and I did it in purpose because business people correlates directly an action to the impact. If I do mindfulness in the office, am I going to have more revenues? Of course not. But if your people are trained to enjoy better what they do, they have meaning in life, they have a little bit more of kindness, they are happier. And you said it, happier. And it is that happiness makes people more productive and more creative. And that's the thing. It's not about having the ultimate results. Is when they are productive and creative, you are going to have not a standard business that is continuously growing. You're going to have something that it could be exponential, because when creativity and productivity is what drives businesses to go 2x, 5x, 10x, or whatever. And that's especially, I mean, I have recognized that in the startup world, because in the startup world, there is a lot of growth that can happen for some of the startups. And I have noticed that when there is this environment of belonging, people are happy, even, I mean, they don't mind about really the time that they're spending, as long as they're spending it with the good people, the people that they want to be, where people are treating themselves in a correct way, with kindness, in fact. And of course, companies can flourish, and people, individuals can also flourish, and that's the good thing. Oof.
Yeah. To that point, I haven't had a lot of good examples of what it means to be like a great manager that's empathetic and kind. I really haven't, but I've had a great example of the opposite. Tyrannical psycho management, which actually is super helpful as well, because, as you said, like if you want to get the most out of your staff and really have them productive, then they need to feel safe. They need to be, I mean, if they're happy, awesome, but at least if they're feeling safe and they feel supported, that when things get choppy, they have a place to go to get help. If you've got that, it gives them a position, it gives them an opportunity for something extraordinary to happen. So from my seat, managerially, it's all about creating that opportunity, not only for our staff, but for clients, for vendors, for all those opportunities to happen. So I can really check down a lot of times, pardon me, which is like, I'm not trying to be helpful. Really what I'm trying to do is not make anything worse first. I don't want to, and I know how this like shows up. It's because you have a boss who gives you that "because I said so" type rhetoric. You're like, hey, I was wondering why can't we work from home like all the time? Why is it only 1 or 2 days a week? And it's because I said so.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. You're like, well, wait, if anything comes into my head because I'm irritated or whatever, I want to give some kind of "because I said so" thing, I know I'm wrong 100% of the time. So I'll backtrack and then listen, hey, what's really going on here? What's the fundamental cause of this conflict? Let's see if I can first not make it worse, and then hopefully see if a solution presents itself.
You made me think about something that is, I don't know if our brain is biased to recognize the bad examples, but suddenly I thought about how many people were bad bosses and how many people were good bosses, and the ratio is 10 to 2. Really, are we biased? Do we feel it more when it is bad? When we have bad bosses? I don't know, because I could only think out of my 18 years of corporate life, 2 bosses who were good people.
I know. It's most bosses think they can be a jerk all week long, drop a box of donuts on your desk on Friday, and now they're a good boss. It's like, dude, I'm gonna blow these donuts up on your chair. What are we doing here?
So getting back to the workplace. So what we always hear that change, if we want to change, I don't know, the culture of a company to make it a little bit more human, change starts at the top. What would be your message for a founder or a CEO to consider creating a business culture centered in kindness, mindfulness, and purpose? What could be the message if you have the magic wand and you have the opportunity to say it face to face?
I would say study The Office and just watch what Michael Scott is doing terribly wrong on that show and don't repeat it. You could see what happens when good intentions go terribly wrong. Uh, there's a lot of times those late night ideas that pop into your head, probably not a good idea. I think the first step is to really become sensitive to it. Like, really, if that's really something you wanted, I want to change the culture. You realize right in the beginning, like, how almost impossible this is going to be to do, how long this is really going to take, how much of a sacrifice this is really going to be. And like, are you fit for that? Are you fit for the kind of cultural change that needs to happen inside of you so that it can emanate to everybody else? Particularly if you're like kind of unraveling perhaps some more toxic type culture. It's going to take a long time. People get traumatized by that stuff. They need to let it out. It also, all this has to happen in kind of a guise of professionalism, which is also a little bit, I wouldn't say anti-human, but it's kind of stifling, right? It's like, hey, we want openness and communication, but boy, we don't go too crazy now. Like we're working with like very delicate balance. So, I'm not even joking with The Office. I think having clear examples of good intentions gone wrong is really something helpful to balance yourself against.
Ryan, again, you made me think about, I have met a guy in my corporate career that was 80% there in terms of Michael Scott, having exactly the same behaviors. Really, I cannot lie. I'm still thinking about this guy. He's still working in that company, by the way.
Oh, me too. I've watched that show and I'm like, boy, it cuts a little close to home sometimes. Ouch.
What do you think it could be? I mean, you mentioned, in fact, that Buddhism have different type of interpretations that can be depending on the culture where you grew up. You told me about the American Buddhism. There is the Japanese Buddhism, the Indian one. And there is this micro, I don't know, entities that could be super specialized. So people have different ways of interpreting the principles of Buddhism. For you, personally, what could be the things that you consider as a misconception of Buddhism?
I think the main one is the idea of enlightenment. We have, I think, kind of a cartoonish representation of that. If you see someone in a cartoon that's been enlightened, they're in this like pose and they're hovering above the ground. And of course, a lot of that has been informed by folklore of like monks that can melt snow and they can levitate and stuff. That and somehow the idea of enlightenment is something to be pursued, and then once you have enlightenment, it's a thing, and you're some kind of Christ-like deity now that drifts off into the sunset. I think it's counterproductive to the essence of Buddhism, which really speaks about like, hey, if you're pursuing enlightenment, this isn't the place for you. And then it whispers behind, it's like, yeah, it is though. So maybe a more accurate way to understand enlightenment is, again, enlightenment is a mental state. You can be in a state of enlightenment. There's maps within Buddhism that will show you as you're approaching those states what kind of things will kind of be arising in your mind and in your body. So if you want to pursue that, that's great. But like, once you climb to the mountaintop, you still got to come down. You know what I mean?
Mm,
Chop wood, carry water. So I think that the idea of enlightenment is, and there's a kind of a purity associated with it. Not only is it inaccurate, but it can be kind of dangerous, because people that are really exploring that will find someone who shows characteristics of what enlightenment means. And traditionally speaking, at least in this country, those people are the ones that are going to try and take your wife. Those are the ones that are going to try and get you to live on some compound. You know what I mean?
that's
So you, within spiritual practice, you need teachers. It's important, but like, you should be real careful, of people kind of creating some utopian design for you, for someone telling you that if this, then everything's okay. The point of this practice is the acknowledgement that, like, this human condition is something that you've got, but there's sensitivity to it in a way that maybe it's a little bit more enjoyable, but maybe you can be helpful for other people, So maybe that would be my one gripe. If you want to open up this can of worms, there's a couple more.
I really like it because um, what you said, in fact, about enlightenment has been a little bit something that has been disturbing me for ages. Because I guess that my first understanding about yogis was through cartoons. I remember that I don't know in English if you say Tintin or Tintin. There was Tintin is a Belgium cartoon that is worldwide known, and I remember that Tintin goes to Nepal, and then he sees yogis. So I was under the impression that these are people who really are floating in the air.
Yeah.
And it took me time. In fact, even when I was a little bit older in university, I had a scientific background, so I couldn't relate to all this understanding about what could mean enlightenment for me. And with the time, it has become more about just trying to search inside of myself uh, what I feel, detect my emotions, understand a little bit more of my values. You mentioned several times this feeling of calm, where things matter less, especially the things that in today's world are matters for others in social media. When we see the type of things that people likes, people with wealth, new cars, new houses, and all this information is constantly bombarding to you. You should consider this to be happy. You should consider that to be happy. And enlightenment is just the search for happiness, for being relaxed. And you make happiness not because you have reached a goal. You make happiness because you have understood that happiness, it means that there is nothing that can harm you, that nothing can be introduced inside of yourself, of your mind, in order to, in fact, if happiness means just be calm, removing harmful stuff, harmful thoughts. Right?
I've got a couple of things to piggyback on that, and I totally agree. My favorite definition of happiness is freedom from the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah.
Once you let that go, there it is, which speaks to the other component of spiritual practice. Again, not something you believe, rather something you do. Speaking to like the secular spirit or scientific materialist, there's benefits to it. The other side from a spiritual component is the insights and meditation, or insights and wisdom traditions. So particularly around Vipassana, watching your thoughts as they come and go, you get more practice and better off with focus and concentration. And what's interesting about that is you have insights, or what other people would call wisdom, or things like that. And these are things about your life. These are things about the world that are not taught to you. It's not something you can read with an alphabet. It's an awareness and understanding that envelops you, and it is a crazy feeling. It's something that washes over you, an insight, and that happens. you know? So for my scientific friends, it's like, I don't have an explanation of why that is. You know, there's really no way to A/B test that or to see what's going on. But it does happen, you know. So and you see an expression and a description of this in every single religious spiritual tradition there is, all through their cultural lens and through their languages. They experience this very similar thing, that once you still yourself, you find practice and focus and concentration, you receive insights and wisdom, which is extraordinary when that happens. So, you know, I think if they're talking about, you know, hey, happiness is freedom from the pursuit of happiness, that's really what they're talking about, is that in the stillness, when you calm the projections of the future, and you calm the regrets from the past, and you really just kind of focus on what's here now, interesting things happen.
And in fact, what is funny and a little bit, yeah, it's in line with what you say. It's like, I still remember that this article, I don't know if it was done 10 years ago, about this monk, a scientist, Mathieu Ricard, the French monk, that they put like, they were putting like a device on his head in order to detect which areas of his brain are enlightening, because there is connections. And in fact, he has been named the happiest person in the world. He's a simple monk who lives, I mean, far away. Sometimes he speaks about the meaning of happiness. And by the way, he has a TED Talk. I still remember that TED Talk. So, I mean, happiness can be proven through science, but this guy is not looking for an ultimate goal. It's not about wealth. It is not about how much science because he still does a little bit of research in terms of the understanding of the brain. But it is only the pathway of removing all the shit that doesn't belong. And that's powerful.
It's also really hard. And you know, there's a great monk, Ajahn Chah, and I love his teaching. And I was reading one of his books, and he's speaking to other monks, and it was hilarious because there's camps, right? You know, it's like, hey, if a monk's talking to me about their experience of happiness, I'm like, yeah, but bro, we got jobs here, man. I don't know what you're doing in the forest. It sounds beautiful, but like, I got bills to pay, you know? So Ajahn Chah was talking to these monks, and he was like, you guys are restless and you're always talking about going into town. He's like, you know what it's like in town? If you had a wife, you'd walk home and she'd be like, what did you do today? That's what your wife wants to know. What did you do today? You, in every single day, you have to describe to her what you did that day. Can you imagine the horror? It was like the funniest thing ever. But it also like evoked in me, man, screw you, Ajahn Chah. What are you doing out there? Just like sitting down and hanging out in the forest and admiring the beauty of nature. You know what I mean? Like we're in here, we're in the mix struggling. So I'm always like really keen on householders, that people are taking these practices and these this desire into the real world, you know, because we can't live on the mountaintop all the time. I know that if I had an enlightenment experience, it would be fleeting, because I got a social security number, you know what I'm saying? I got to pay these taxes because they're coming for me. So as much as I love the monastic tradition from a romantic perspective, really I'm looking for practical things that are going to help normal people, you know.
Indeed. Oh, Ryan, so we are almost at the end, but I just wanted to understand. So how are you changing the world with your two companies, Kitcaster and Wildcast? What are you doing? Is there a purpose? Do you really want to change the world with these companies? Tell me more about them.
Yeah, you know, I think my best opportunity to change the world is to love my children and steer them in the right direction. You know, the one thing you do, if you want to be a real Buddhist, the one thing you do have to believe in is reincarnation, because there's no scientific evidence of that. But it's encouraging, because then it kind of releases you from the stress of having one life. It's like, yeah, if I take this one life and change their rudder direction just 10% in 100 lives, you know, my progeny are going to do great. So I like that idea. But if I can, you know, there's a principle in Buddhism called right livelihood. And the fact that I work in podcasting, to me, really feels like right livelihood, because, whereas you're creative and you're out here creating opportunities, and creating new thought. We actually facilitate that opportunity, which feels like a really great place for us. We're gatekeepers in a sense of, we're making connections. We're saying like, hey, Ivan, here's this person. You guys need to have a conversation. And then you bring that out, and that kind of like platonic thing of like idea synthesis, something new is born. And we do that thousands of times, so it just feels absolutely fantastic of just the interconnectivity of what we do, the kind of butterfly effect that it puts out into the world, the results we hear from clients, anywhere from like raising millions of dollars to, hey, I met a new friend, hey, I'm going to a conference, I'm speaking at a conference. There's all these unbelievable, amazing outcomes that come from the work we do, which is just facilitating conversations. So if we have our message, or our mission rather, is just celebrate good conversation, because at the end of the day, what I really want to do is get back to that keg party where you're standing around talking philosophy. So if we can create that over Zoom, let's do it. And instead of beer, it's just coffee. Okay, hey, even better.
That's right. I think that there is a, a real need to create these meaningful connections. It's not like offer and demand. I have found someone and then there is no great match. I like it that by luck, you and me, we have met, because I feel that a little bit of understanding of, and that's the thing that should happen in any podcast, that you meet people that you really want to know more of. And that, if
I agree.
that's good.
Without sounding too hyperbolic, to your point of changing the world with what we do, I have the tendency to back off of it, but actually I kind of want to double down. The fact is that our culture, our world has unsurmountable problems, whether it's climate change or it's potential war or it's the polarization of different viewpoints. It seems like we're culminating into like some kind of horrible future. I don't believe that's true, but I know that the only tool we have to fix that is by connecting to each other and talking it out. That's it. There's no magic spell. There's no technological app. There's nothing. All we can do, the only thing we can do is come together and talk. So for us to be able to facilitate a small part of that, I believe it's kind of fractal and holographic in that nature, that within that small thing contains the whole thing. So I feel really good about being able to bring people together, because in essence, I believe this is the only way that it'll save the planet.
Right. Ryan, if people wants to reach out to you, how can they find you? I know about LinkedIn, so
Yep.
that's one. Ryan Estes. You Google it, and you search for it. I will put the details below this podcast. Where else can we find or get to know a little bit more about your businesses?
You bet. You can check out kitcaster.com. And then go Wildcast, which is a new venture we're working on now. You can definitely hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm totally excited to talk to anybody about any of this stuff, for sure. I have receded a bit from social media, but very active in podcasting. So would love to talk to anybody that would like to reach out.
Ryan, if you were in front of me physically, I will give you a hug. And today I'm going to give you a mental hug. It was lovely to meet you. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. I hope that the rest of my audience is going to enjoy it. Thank you very much, Ryan, for your time, and have a great, great day.
You too, Ivan, and I really appreciate what you do. We couldn't do what we do without it, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Ryan.